My name's Bianca Bruno, and I am a reporter and podcast co host for Courthouse News. And if you're not familiar, that is our podcast called Sidebar, which we've had for over a year now, where we discuss, consequential legal issues in the United States and their impact on everyday folks' lives, and not just those who are in the insular legal community. And so I am here today with Kirk McDaniel and Stephen Paulsen, and they are two of our reporters based in Texas. And they have reported fairly extensively on Governor Greg Abbott's executive order directing the state's Department of Family. Let me make sure I get it correct. Um, Family and Protective Services. Is that correct?
Yes.
Directing that department to investigate the parents of trans children who are seeking or providing or aiding in their children receiving gender affirming care. And so that was an order a couple months ago that really had kind of a shakedown effect in the state for a lot of different folks whose lives it touched. And we're doing a follow up to that and to our podcast episode where we kind of explored those issues. So I'm going to start with Kirk first, because Kirk, you had a story on Friday with an update in the legal battle related to Governor Greg Abbott's executive order. And that was an order, for those who are just joining, directing the Department of Family and Protective Services to investigate parents of trans kids who are helping their kids receive gender affirming care. So, Kirk, what exactly did that order say?
Hey guys, happy to be here. Yeah, so on Friday, the Texas Supreme Court, a little bit of background on exactly what this ruling was. It was not a ruling necessarily on the merits of this case. What it was the state petition for what's known as a writ of mandamus, basically petitioning the Texas Supreme Court to strike down a Court of Appeals ruling that enjoined the state entirely from conducting such investigations like Governor Abbott has directed the Department of Family and Protective Services to do. So this ruling essentially reversed and um, granted relief on one of those things that the state was looking for, and that was that they now have the authority to continue conducting such investigations, except for one family, and that is the plaintiffs in the sort of initial case, who filed this initial lawsuit against the state for conducting such investigations. Um, I will say notably about this opinion, while that's the headline that the state can now continue to conduct these investigations, I think there's some really important parts that I covered in my story that the state Supreme Court really emphasized that um, no official, the attorney general, the governor, does not have the authority to sort of legally bind the Department of Family and Protective Services to conduct these investigations. They even stressed that the Texas legislature gave the department the sole authority to essentially conduct investigations of child abuse or neglect, without any hindrance from the governor or any other parts of state government.
Well,
And so, with that being said, oh, go ahead.
Well, I
Go ahead.
think that's an interesting point, and that was something that had me, as someone who is familiar what's going on in Texas, but I'm not a Texan and haven't, read through the orders like you have, but it had me scratching my head because if the executive order, right, and I think this was from your story related to the state Supreme Court ruling on Friday, but if the executive order from Abbott didn't cite any legal authority allowing the state to direct the Department of Family and Protective Services to investigate those parents, then why is the Supreme Court allowing the state to resume these child abuse investigations that had been paused?
Sure. So it's actually, and this is, I think, one of those things that's a little confusing, especially for folks out of state. So what Governor Abbott did was more of a directive and not a formal executive action. And so, sort of, if you think about it like the president of the United States, he can, through executive action, direct agencies in the executive branch of government to do, the things that he tells them to do. For Texas, we have seen Governor Abbott do similar things when it comes to sort of immigration or emergency management. But with this, the Department of Family and Protective Services has the sole authority on who it conducts investigations on, basically. So with this, it's basically Abbott trying to say the rules have now changed, that parents who provide gender affirming care to their transgender children, that is a form of child abuse. And so by changing that framework, then he is saying, now because it is child abuse, I would like you to conduct these investigations. And the state Supreme Court is basically stepping in to say that the directive is not legally binding, that the department may have interpreted that directive as something that was legally binding, and they, within their own authority, are within their right under the law to do such investigations.
Mm-hmm.
But there is no law on the books that they have to say conduct these investigations. And I will say I'm not entirely sure if any more investigations have been opened up since Friday.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of people who are very curious, probably Stephen and myself, who are very curious to see, after this ruling, does the Department of Family and Protective Services act on sort of this opening? Do they continue conducting the investigations, or do they back off due to the public pressure?
Yeah, I think that.
Oh, go ahead, Stephen. You can chime in.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think that is kind of the big question at this point. I asked the Department of Family and Protective Services whether they have opened any new investigations following this opinion on Friday. I haven't heard back from them yet.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking to some other sources, no one has heard about any investigations being opened since then. But, of course, a lot of this stuff is pretty confidential. I do know that the department is planning to put out a statement at some point regarding this opinion and what it means. I've not gotten that statement yet. So I think it's a pretty big question mark at this point, kind of what comes next.
So there's not even an indication from the agency whether it plans, how it plans to use its discretion regarding these investigations. If it agrees with Abbott's order and wants to restart them, or if under the discretion that the Supreme Court and the state is emphasizing it has, if it's going to choose not to investigate, or if it might be a hybrid and do some fact finding and perhaps investigate some families and not others.
Right.
Yeah.
Kirk, I did have a question about the family that was exempted from the ruling on Friday. Why, if you can kind of emphasize why they were exempted, and what that family's ties are to the Texas Department of Family and Protective Services.
Sure, yeah. So that family, sort of rewinding all the way back to the very beginning of this in February, they were seen as sort of one of the first families that was being investigated by the Department of Family and Protective Services. It just so happens that the mother of a 16-year-old transgender child actually works for the department and conducted similar investigations into claims of child abuse, neglect, and she was actually put on leave whenever this order came down. Of course, the department said that they were going to go ahead and adhere to this order. So they hired a lawyer, and they, along with their child's doctor, sued the state. And that sort of is what brought us here today. Now, why is it that they are still exempt and the state can open up investigations into any other families? Well, the Texas Supreme Court sort of ruled that, or not really sort of, but they did rule that what was wrong with the Court of Appeals is that the Court of Appeals affirmed an injunction that the state put in for that lawsuit against them specifically being investigated. The Court of Appeals affirmed that, but then went further. And the state Supreme Court is stepping in to say it was within its authority to place that injunction while this case continues on through the appeals process. However, it did not have the authority to enjoin any and all parties who might be investigated, to enjoin basically the department from doing this wholesale all over the state.
And of course, that could change if other families also filed suit. Do you know if that's happened? Is that something you've been able to look into?
I am not aware of any other lawsuits that have been filed. I think that it all happened very quickly, in fact, where the governor announced this directive of the department, and then we saw the first lawsuit come and an injunction in that case. And then not so long after, we saw an injunction against the state wholesale.
Yeah.
So I'm very curious with this new ruling if that's what it's going to lead to. And I guess that kind of leads into that other big question of, well, if the state opens up these investigations, then, we're going to see more lawsuits. But, is it going to be, are there going to be any more investigations? And if there is also one more thing I might add to that, with this ruling, I think that there's a little bit more fodder for people who are seeking to block this directive or to block the department from doing so, especially now because the state Supreme Court has said that there is no legal authority that the governor has to force the department to do this.
Yeah.
So why are you doing it to begin with, on top of the fact that many medical associations and organizations have come out and supported gender affirming care and what it does for helping transgender youth.
Yeah. I know that case with that family really stuck out to me because for those who are just joining, when we had a podcast episode that explored this that aired a couple weeks ago. If you want to listen to that, it's Sidebar, and you can get that anywhere where you listen to podcasts. But when Stephen came on to talk about the status of folks working with the Department of Family and Protective Services in Texas, he mentioned that an impact of being investigated by a child protective services agency is that could impact a parent's employment, especially those with government jobs. And I think that family is a perfect example of that, because that was an employee within the agency that is now on leave and being investigated. Do you, or Stephen, do you know if that parent has resumed working, or is that something we don't know right now?
Oh, yeah, I'm not sure, to be honest.
I guess my only other question for you, Kirk, is, and this is something you mentioned in your story on Friday, was the law in Texas, related to what the Department of Family and Protective Services is, ordered to do or required to do. The law hasn't changed, and Abbott's executive order hasn't so far been codified by the legislature. But do you think that could change in the near future?
Absolutely. I would say that for anyone who follows Texas politics, this last legislative session that I covered, which I think it might also be important for listeners to know. So the Texas legislature meets biannually, so they meet every 2 years, and next year they will be meeting. And there were many bills that were proposed, and then some that even passed that targeted transgender youth. The ones that were proposed would have actually changed the legal definition of gender affirming care to child abuse. It is very similar to what we just saw happen in Alabama. Now, there were other bills that were passed as well targeting transgender youth, and the state has actually signed a bill into law that is effect law of the land at this moment that um, bans children who are in public school from engaging or from playing on a sports team that aligns with their gender identity. So that is the only bill that has passed so far that is impacting this group. But I will say that whenever we see this next session come up, a lot of people are expecting a lot of the same very conservative members of the Texas State Senate and the Texas House to bring these bills back up, as well as maybe even emulating them off of, say, bills that are much more successful and have been passed into law, like the one in Alabama. And I did just also want to mention too. So, talking about this, Texas is, of course, one of the largest states in the nation. A 2017 study found that there's around nearly 14,000 transgender youth in the country, and that's 2017. So those numbers may be a little bit larger or smaller at this point, but just a good sort of framework to understand this, how many people in the state this is impacting.
Well, we'll be looking for your future coverage following up on this case and, what I imagine may be other cases that will be filed in the coming months. So let's turn to an update from Stephen Paulsen. And for those just joining, Stephen is our West Texas reporter, and he has followed this really interesting and I think important thread to follow in the fallout of this executive order in Texas regarding child abuse investigations of parents of trans teens. And he is interested in the folks at the actual agency, and that's the Department of Family and Protective Services, and the employment numbers and people who have actually quit since that order was signed in February. So, Stephen, can you kind of give some background on what you knew in the story reported last month, and if that has since changed, if you've gotten some updates?
Sure, totally. Yeah, so as you know, I did a story, I guess it was around a month or so ago, speaking to people within DFPS, the Department of Family and Protective Services, who were deciding that they couldn't stay with the agency following these directives from Attorney General Paxton and Governor Abbott. What I'm hearing anecdotally from people who work at the agency, who have worked at the agency, is that quite a lot of people have been leaving over this. So I've been sort of trying over the past few weeks to kind of dig into the data a little bit more. I just around a week and a half ago got a response back. I'd asked the agency for numbers on people who had resigned from both CPS and CPI. So that's Child Protective Services, and then also Child Protective Investigations. That's the branch of the agency that actually would be tasked with, following up on these allegations of child abuse. Nothing so far that has really jumped out at me. That the numbers aren't. The numbers don't show like a big spike. Speaking to sources, I've heard like a few different reasons for that. Some people are taking family medical leave rather than quitting outright. Some people are being asked to stay on. And then really critically, I followed up with the agency today, actually, and they confirmed to me that rather than giving me data on when people had submitted their resignations, they had actually given me data on people's effective resignation date, which I think is really important because basically it means that there are a lot of people who have submitted resignations who did not leave the agency yet within the time frame that I'd requested data for. So unfortunately, probably will need to be filing some more records requests. I don't have really firm and kind of interesting numbers at this point. But then just a quick note on my methodology. So the way I've been kind of approaching this, I asked for the month after February 22nd, which is when Abbott put out his letter directing the FPS to investigate these families. I asked for a month before that, and then the same like February 22nd to March 22nd timeframe in a few different years to kind of compare. So I'll probably be going back at this point and seeing if I can, asking for a slightly larger time frame or a more current time frame if there's something that shows up. I know that's not kind of the most exciting update, but that's sort of where things stand at this point.
Well, in your story, you talked to they were trans themselves, DFPS worker who, under the executive order by Abbott, they had to investigate a family and publicly announced they were quitting. Have you followed up with them at all? Do you know if they actually quit?
Yes, so they have left the agency. To be honest, I don't know the exact date that they left. But I was following up a little bit with a supervisor in the agency, this person, Randa Molinax, who's also someone who spoke to me for this story, about kind of digging into the data a little bit with her. And she actually was the one who brought up this really important point about sort of the timeline of resignation. So, for example, she had submitted her resignation sometime within that first month, but did not officially leave the agency until May. So that's sort of case in point of someone that, did leave the agency and did resign pretty quickly after this letter, but would not show up in a data set like this.
And I think in our prior conversations, when you came on the podcast, we just talked about how, basically all eyes are on DFPS now. So even beyond, their policy and the way they implement this executive order and the way they follow it or choose not to follow it based on the Supreme Court ruling last week, it kind of remains to be seen. But at this point, people are paying attention to them. And I think you said you hadn't really reported on them in the past, but now you were interested in, kind of how they operate and perhaps some other things that they touch on that you might be looking into. Do you have any kind of updates or insight related to that?
In terms of other sort of issues that are going on at DFPS, you mean? I mean, there has been quite a lot going on at that agency, and I think it's an important point because, unfortunately, these directives to investigate trans families are not the only reason why people are deciding to leave. So there was a case of alleged child abuse at a state contracted center. And then on top of that, there's just, speaking to workers in this agency, they say that they are really, overworked, really overburdened. There's this aspect of what CPS does called CWAP, which is child without placement. It's basically CPS people will take shifts to watch kids that have not yet been placed into a foster family or an adoptive family. And that has been something that's come up speaking to workers as just something that is a really stressful task and is a lot of extra work on top of, a full day of having to do these investigations and stuff. People say that, they have to work late into the night, that they get called onto shift pretty last minute. So I think sort of bottom line is that there is a lot going on with this agency right now. And I think some of the issues around this directive, I think, have really kind of caught the attention of a lot of people, but it's unfortunately kind of hardly the only issue that the agency is dealing with.
Was there anything else you wanted to kind of explore that I haven't asked you?
I mean, I guess the one thing that I would say, so Kirk, as you know, was the one who really dug into this Friday ruling. I spoke a little bit to sources about kind of how they were feeling about everything. And I think sort of the biggest takeaway for me, I think in some ways people kind of see it as a win for trans families. But I think it's important to note that it's something that doesn't really kind of like wrap up this issue in a neat way. And I think, unfortunately, for families who are impacted by all of this, there's still going to be a lot more uncertainty kind of going forward in terms of what this agency is going to do, how the state is going to handle all of this. So I guess that's the one thing that I would add.
Okay. Well, I appreciate you coming on and Kirk coming on and following this important Texas story that the nation is really watching as some states are starting to emulate what's going on in Texas. So we'll look for more of your reporting. And if you're interested in what we discussed today, we recently had a podcast episode talking about these issues, and that is at Sidebar, and our Twitter is Sidebar CMS. And you can find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. So thanks for joining.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much.